All right, let's jump into our porcelain lecture then. So we've gotten to the point where we have our casted restoration. So just to pick up from where we left off, so once we have our wax up done, we're going to invest our wax up. We talked about 3 different investments, right? We talked about gypsum, phosphate bonded, and ethyl silicate. And then those are classified by, or those are the categories of binders in this investment material. So the binder is the stuff that holds everything together. What's the second part, or what else is in an investment material? The refractory material. And that's made out of what? Silica. So the amount of silica that they put in that investment material controls the thermal expansion of it. Okay, so again, all these things are contracting, shrinking, expanding in differing amounts, from your impression material to your stone, to your investment, to your metal. So we have differing products in which we can use to help even all those things out. Okay, so refractory plus binder. Those are the 2 things in investment material. Gypsum bonded materials we don't use very much anymore because they are only good at lower temperatures. And now most of the metals that we use for our castings, whether it's a full metal crown or a PFM, are higher melting temperatures. Okay. Before, when gold was cheap, they would use a lot of high gold content, which didn't need to be melted as high, right? So that's why gypsum bonded was sort of the go-to, because you get better surface detail, but quickly, as the other metals gained in popularity, we switched away from it. And ethyl silicate, that's only used for our removable partial denture metal frameworks, and we'll have a slide on that in this lecture. So don't need to know too much about RPDs just yet. You'll get that in November, but just know that the ethyl silicate is used to invest our metal framework for removable partial dentures. All right, so we get our coping casted. So remember, when we make a PFM crown, first we wax it up to the full contour of the restoration. Then what do we have to do to get this coping? We have to cut back the wax an even amount, right, to make room for the porcelain. So once you've cut it back, you're going to get sort of a thimble that gets invested and casted. And then this is sort of what we're left with. So if you remember from the video, one of the first steps after divesting that coping was, 1, cut off the sprue, obviously. But then also was to put it back, or put it into an oven. So the purpose of putting it in the oven is to create this oxidation layer, this oxide layer. So in each of the metals, if you remember going back to the metals, you have your sort of main components or constituents of the metal. So for your high noble metals, it's a lot of gold, platinum, palladium. But within each of those types of metals, you're going to have trace elements of other stuff in there. And the other stuff we'll show in this next slide is for high noble metals, you're generally, or high noble and noble metals, you're going to find trace elements of iron, tin, indium, and gallium. So some, depending on the metal, they'll have these in differing amounts. Okay, some won't have any iron, some won't have any tin, and so on and so forth. So each specific metal is going to have their own trace elements of these materials, and these trace materials act as sort of oxidizing agents. So we need an oxide layer in order for something for the porcelain to bind to. Right? We're trying to get a bond between the porcelain and the metal. Thus, we call it a porcelain fused to metal restoration, a PFM. So if we don't put this in the oven and form this oxide layer, then we're not going to get a good bond of the porcelain. So your base metals, obviously they're composed of differing elements, so they're going to have differing oxidizing agents. So they have chromium and then titanium, or, you know, again, depends on the composition of that specific base metal. But the idea is you have trace elements, or you have certain elements in the alloy which act as the oxidizing layer. And the oxide layer is important to create a chemical bond between the metal and the porcelain. And it's important to have a controlled layer of this, or a controlled oxide layer, meaning you don't want it too thin, you don't want it too thick. Too thin means that the porcelain doesn't have enough thickness for that to bind to. I say that right? If it's too thin, it doesn't have enough. If it's too thick, then that bond may be weak. Okay. So once again, this oxide layer is formed by placing the substructure on the firing tray and then raising the temperature. Basically, you heat it up and it forms this oxide layer. Question? Yes. Mm-hmm.
So is that only for the titanium casting?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's very specific.
Right, right. Yeah, so those are just a couple examples of the base metal, just to contrast that they don't have tin or indium or gallium in those base metals. They use different formulations of it. So we talked about this because of the lower cost. The use of base metals is now widespread. So here's a disadvantage of base metals. So we said base metals are cheaper, right? And it's balanced by the fact that, well, it's cheaper, but it's harder to use in the sense that base metals tend to undergo continuous oxidation. So the oxide layer for a base metal is harder to control, and a lot of times you end up with a thicker oxide layer than you need. So that's a disadvantage of using the base metal. So if you look at the pictures on the right, so the top part that's labeled P, that stands for the porcelain. Here, and then this is our metal. And then you see this part here is our oxide layer. You can almost think of this as the hybrid layer that you learn about in your operative class, where it's a mixture of sort of the two together. And this is just a graph showing the composition of the material as you cut through the cross-section. Question? What is the hybrid layer? Okay, so this is P for porcelain. This is the metal, and you see how it's sort of sprinkled. I don't know. How do you describe it? It looks different. Porous? Okay. Integrated? Sure. Like a hybrid between the two? So there's a... Basically, the idea is that parts of each component have intermixed with each other, thus forming a, it's an area that's bonded together. So distance along the interface, so you go from metal to ceramic, and you see how the differing compositions will change as you go through each of the interface. So the hybrid layer, right at that junction, you're going to have a mixture of all these components. Okay? So that's your oxide layer once it's bonded to the porcelain. Clear about that? So we put it in the oven to form this oxide layer. We have differing elements that are added to those alloys to function as oxidizing agents. And base metals end up with a thicker oxide layer because it's harder to control. All right, let's talk about porcelain. So the specific type of porcelain we'll talk about, and most traditionally used for PFMs, is what we call feldspathic porcelain. This is all the same porcelain that you'll use when you tend to think about your classic veneers. And the most aesthetic porcelain we have is what we call, or is this, our feldspathic porcelain. So it starts with feldspar, and basically that picture on the upper left, you can imagine a bunch of that. They'll grind that down, and they'll pre-treat that, and then they'll add certain pigments to it for certain colors. Okay, and once once the companies break that down, they'll formulate different shades of this feldspar that they've ground down, and they'll call that feldspathic porcelain. So we have some information up top on the slide. Feldspar is the main raw component of the dental porcelains. Its mineral state, it's crystalline and opaque. And you can see the chemical formulations. But that's what it's based off of. And then in order to use it for dental applications, we've added certain pigmentations, as well as other elements to control the sintering temperature and also the amount that it contracts in solubility. Okay. So once they've added all that, then we get our feldspathic porcelain, which in the video we saw where they had powder plus liquid and they kind of stack it on to the metal coping, right? So this is what is important to know about feldspathic porcelain. It comes in two different phases once it's sintered together. So you have your glassy phase and then your crystalline phase. So hopefully this sounds a little familiar from our dental materials class, but the glassy phase is a disorganized or amorphous phase. And what this functions, or the advantage of this is that it's got properties that are typical of glass, meaning that it's translucent and it gives the aesthetic, or makes that porcelain more aesthetic, right? So if you look at our teeth and dentin and enamel, especially the enamel, there's certain translucency that we see on the tooth. So we're trying to mimic what the tooth looks like. The downside to that is that it's a little fragile. So if you drop a piece of glass, obviously it'll probably break. So to help make that stronger, there's also a crystalline phase. So based on the formulation of the feldspathic porcelain they have, they generally make or design it so that the crystalline phase makes up about 15 to 25% of the volume of the ceramic, right? Or the porcelain. So this is to provide strength for it. So this makes sense because, well, if you have crystals, you think of something that's very orderly. Something that's orderly is going to provide some strength to it. Okay, so it's organized, orderly, crystalline provides the strength, and the glassy amorphous phase provides the aesthetics. So if you go back to this slide, you can see how, so this is a SEM cross-section of it. So glassy matrix, this is what the GM stands for, and LC stands for lucite, which you can think of it as the crystalline phase. So this chemical formula is just designating lucite, so LC, and you can see that the lucite is intermixed with that glassy matrix. So this is what it looks like once it's fused or sintered together. Okay, so we're going to talk about the differing layers that we have. So just as a summary, we have our first layer that we apply onto the metal coping is what layer? The opaque layer. And why do we want the opaque layer? So it blocks out the darkness of the metal. So the other reason the opaque layer is important is because, well, that's the one that's actually binding to the metal. So that's the one responsible for the porcelain fusing to the metal, right? It's the first layer you put on. And notice the firing temperatures, or the sintering temperatures of this material as we go down the list. So notice how for opaque, the paste opaque layer, that's at 975. And by the time you're close to finishing the crown and you're putting a glaze on it, it's at 945 degrees centigrade. So this makes sense because we know we have to put this crown in the oven multiple times because we're putting multiple layers of porcelain. So you're going to start with your highest fusing layer of porcelain so that when you put on the second layer, you're going to drop down the temperature so that the first layer isn't disturbed, right? So if your temperature never reaches the sintering temp of the opaque layer, then the opaque layer is going to stay more or less where it's at. So as you fire multiple times, multiple layers, you got to pay attention to what type of porcelain you're putting on, and also what the temperature is, the firing temperature, because you always want to go in successive or decreasing temperature. Because you can imagine if you put on your last layer of porcelain and it happens to sinter at 1,000 degrees. Well, guess what happens to all your other layers that you had put on? Well, all that kind of melts away, or kind of is liquid again, and it's going to change its shape in the oven. So the idea is that whatever you had already sintered, right, because what happens when you mix the powder and liquid and put it in the oven, it gets hard. You want it to stay there. You don't want it to slump or change dimensions as you put on more layers. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we talked about this. The opaque layer is to block out the metal coping. It is responsible for the metal ceramic bonds. The darkness of the metal will affect the value, so you'll hear about this word later on. Dr. Alguindi, our process director, will be giving us the science behind light and color lecture. The value just means the brightness of the shade, so that needs to be mass, meaning that we don't want the darkness of the metal shining through. So ideally, this opaque layer should be limited to 0.1 millimeters if we can. So this maximizes the amount of porcelain that we have for, the pretty stuff, the enamel and dentin layers. So we talked about this a little bit already, but sintering, that's a process of compacting and forming a solid mass of material. So this is what happens when you mix a powder and liquid and you put it in a hot oven. So if you guys have played around with ceramics in your, summer camps and stuff, you know that you put some ceramic in a hot oven and it gets hard, right? The important part, I think, in this slide is that when done under a vacuum, then you decrease the porosities in the porcelain. So a lot of times you'll see this that they have it under some sort of vacuum. So an aid in the reduction of porosity in dental porcelain is vacuum firing. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the coefficient of thermal expansion. So we know that porcelain is best under compression instead of tension. So once the ceramic heats up and cools down, ideally we have that porcelain under a slight amount of compression. So one of the things that you'll see on the picture is this radial compressive strength, right? So as long as porcelain's in compression, then that's in its preferred state. So you know porcelain's pretty fragile because you got this glassy matrix, right? So glass, it needs to be well supported. So in order to kind of maximize the potential of the material, we want to make sure that it's in some sort of compression. So how do we do that? Well, there's this idea of a coefficient of thermal expansion. Basically, this number dictates how much that this material will expand when it's heated. So if you think about what the two materials we're talking about, porcelain plus metal, each is going to have a differing coefficient of thermal expansion. The question is, how close do we want those to match? And if one is going to be different than the other, which one should expand more? And the answer to that is, in order to keep the porcelain under a slight amount of compression, you want the coefficient of thermal expansion of the porcelain to be just a little bit less than the metal. Right? So most porcelains have a coefficient of thermal expansion between 13 and 14, so 10 to the minus 6 degrees centigrade. And the metals are between 13.5 and 14.5. So the difference is 0.5 times 10 to the negative 6. All right, so when you have that difference, the idea is as the porcelain cools, you can think of it this way, the porcelain is going to shrink a little bit more, and it's going to kind of hug the metal substructure. So it's going to be in a little bit of compression. It's sort of hugging on to it. So unless you want to really get into the material science of it, maybe we'll just remember it that way. I don't know how it makes sense, or how an easy way for you guys to, how it makes sense in your head, but that's the way I think about it. As it cools, the porcelain is going to hug a little bit onto the metal, and then it's going to be placed in a slight amount of compression. So the important part is there's a difference in the CTE. The difference is about 0.5 times 10 to the negative 6. And if you're going to have one that is a smaller CTE, you're going to make sure that the porcelain is just slightly less, so that when it shrinks, it'll have it'll hug the metal just a little bit more. Okay. All right, we have this concept of unsupported porcelain. So the best way to kind of think about it is let's look at the picture on the lower right side. So we have two differing crowns, and look at the difference between the metal substructure underneath. So in this scenario, you can see that what probably had happened is they waxed up the crown to its full contour, and they cut back an even amount of the wax so that when they stack the porcelain, you'll have a more even layer of porcelain all the way around. Whereas in this scenario, all they did was they dipped the dye in that wax and then didn't really care about what the final contour of the crown looked like. Therefore, you're going to have areas where the amount of porcelain is a little thicker than you want. So generally something, let's say, over 2 millimeters of thickness of porcelain is not good because some of that porcelain is not supported by something rigid underneath. Therefore, if you have unsupported porcelain, you're going to have an area that is prone to fracture. Right? So unsupported porcelain is not good because it leads to fracture. And then in order to prevent this, the best way is to do a full contour wax up with an even cutback so that you get a metal casting that is designed specifically for the contour of this tooth. So I guess we can read through this real quick. So we know that the porcelain needs to be highly rigid in order to prevent fracture. So even a little bit of flexibility in the porcelain will cause it to break. Okay, so there's very low tolerance for it to flex. The minimal metal coping necessary is 0.3 millimeters. And then this is just talking about if the technician, all they did is dip the wax pattern and didn't do the full contour wax up with the cutback, a lot of times you're going to have a area that the porcelain is thin. And then it's going to lack the proper support. Okay? So when you do see porcelain that this fracture, typically what you'll find is that in the posterior, you're going to find the fracture on the marginal ridges. And then for the anterior, a typical place to find it is this scenario here at the corners of the incisal edge. Those are the areas that are most typical for porcelain to be unsupported. Okay, so let's talk about different types of failures. So there's two words that we'll use to describe the failures in sort of this bonded sense. So this applies to porcelain, this applies to composite, anything that has sort of an interface. We're going to have this adhesive versus cohesive failure. So if you look at the line that says failure, wherever that's pointing to, it's either pointing to an interface or it's pointing to a part that's within the material itself. So if you look at the cohesive failures, so let's start with figure C. So the top part of that, the white stuff, is porcelain. So we're saying if the porcelain fractures within the same material, we call that a cohesive failure. So the definition, let's see. The highest bond strength leads to failure within porcelain when tested, figure C. This is observed when, so that happens when you get a good bond between the metal and the porcelain. So the porcelain becomes your sort of your weakest link. This is called a cohesive failure. Another area that you may see a cohesive failure is if the fracture or the failure happens within the oxide layer itself. So a lot of times this happens when the oxide layer is too thick and it's sort of a weak point. You'll see failures there. And then you'll see what we call an adhesive failure, where it just delaminates right at the junction. So the junction you'll typically find is between the metal and the oxide layer. So that's figure A. So again, if you don't have the proper oxidizing agents, or if you don't put it in the oven and create that oxide layer correctly, then sometimes the porcelain itself won't even bond to the metal because it'll fail at that metal to oxide layer junction. Okay. So you got to know the difference between adhesive, cohesive. Yes?
That's formed when you
Yeah, so when they talk about the oxide or the oxide layer, they'll consider that kind of one
Once it's formed.
once it's formed. Yeah, so they'll consider that one homogeneous material, even though it's a mixture of the two. So if you want to simplify it, okay, metal, just a straight metal, you have your oxide layer, which is a combination of the two, and then you'll have your porcelain, which is just a pure porcelain. Okay. All right. So, but yeah, you're right, it's true. The oxide layer is sort of a mixture of the two. But once it's mixed, they'll say, okay, that's its own separate homogeneous material. All right, so adhesive, cohesive, just terms you got to know. Okay? Let's talk about margin designs. So remember we created a 1.2 millimeter flat shoulder. So we want things to be flat because porcelain is good in compression, so you don't want any bumps or irregularities. You just want something flat. So a typical margin design is what we call this porcelain butt margin. You see how the metal coping just comes straight down to the junction of the axial wall and then the beginning of your margin, and the rest of that thickness is made up of porcelain. So the extension of porcelain onto a shoulder preparation, often used on a PFM to prevent a visible metal margin. So this maximizes the aesthetics of it. The challenge is it's hard to get a well-sealing, or it's more technique sensitive. It takes more work to get that porcelain margin to seal really nicely. Okay, so oftentimes labs will charge you a little bit more money because it just takes more work for them to make this porcelain butt margin. Another design that you'll see is what we call a disappearing metal margin, where if you look at the cross section of that, so maybe look at the left, picture on the left, you see how the metal underneath extends out to the edge of the margin? And then you'll bulk up the porcelain from there. Okay? So a disappearing metal margin extends to the end, extends to and ends at the edge of the margin. So this design is less technique sensitive. However, you would argue that, well, it may not look as good because your metal may be a little bit more opaque there or a little bit more dark. Okay? So, but maybe for a posterior tooth, maybe you're okay using this disappearing metal margin. For an anterior tooth, you may want to stick to a porcelain butt margin because it's the most aesthetic margin that we have for these PFMs. Okay? So just a difference between the two. And then actually, if you look at, the last one is a 360 metal margin or a 360 metal collar. So in areas that you don't care about aesthetics at all, let's say the patient when they smile shows none of their gingival margins, and you want the best seal around it, then you can do a 360 metal collar because we know that a casted margin seals better than a porcelain margin. So just the process of casting is more accurate than stacking on porcelain and then sintering, right? So those are the main margins that we'll use. In your textbooks, you're going to find in different labs, they'll have all these different designs of margins. I don't need you guys to know all these margin designs, just to show you that, you know, there's other designs out there too. But the ones that you'll hear us talking about in our lab, in our clinic, are these three. So for PFMs, so porcelain butt margin, our disappearing metal margin, and the 360 metal margin. So our default, we're going to do the porcelain butt margin. Sometimes your clinic director, they're going to prescribe specifically a disappearing margin or a 360 metal margin, depending on the clinical situation. So your third and fourth year, those are the things you're kind of trying to learn is, okay, you know, try to figure out the decision-making process of which margin design is better. Okay? Questions about that? So something else that can differ is your metal-ceramic junction, basically where your metal and ceramics meet. So sometimes you'll want a metal occlusal or a metal lingual. So look at the figure A there. You can see where the arrow is pointing. That's where the lower tooth is hitting that crown on the lingual surface. So you have the option to make it in porcelain or metal. And then same with the occlusal surface of a posterior tooth. So the way we have it prepared is that we want porcelain all over the occlusal surface. Sometimes you may run into a situation where you'll say, hey, I want my facial cusp and facial wall, or the facial aspect of this crown to be in porcelain, but I want the functional area to be in metal. And that's okay too. So this is just to show there's differing designs in where the metal can go. And you want to specify in your lab prescription how you want it designed. So, of course, if you're going to do a metal functional cusp, then actually your reduction is still going to be the same here. It's 1.5 in your functional cusp. Okay? But there are certain situations in which you can be more conservative. And once you get in the anterior tooth, we'll know that if you're going to do a metal lingual here, you don't have to reduce as much tooth structure here because the metal is stronger than the porcelain. Okay? So don't need to memorize all these designs. The idea is that the occlusal lingual surfaces can be fabricated in metal or porcelain. Therefore, it's important to specify how you want it designed. The other important part about this is that you got to pay attention to where the contact points are. So obviously you don't want the opposing tooth to be hitting at the metal ceramic junction because that's an area that is weak. So our principle is we want to keep any contact points 1.5 millimeters away from the metal to ceramic junction. So pretty simple concept to understand, I think. Don't want the contacting points to be right at the interface. You want a little distance between the contacting point and the junction because you don't want that porcelain to fracture. All right, so a little bit about, so this kind of goes back to that you have different designs of the metal structures, right? Remember we talked about a survey crown? A survey crown specifically is one that a removable partial denture attaches to. So you can see the lingual surface of this tooth is designed to be in all metal because when they make the metal framework for the partial, well, it's going to contact this area. It's going to seat right in those little grooves. We'll call this a rest seat. Question? Does it compromise a tooth? Yeah, so a tooth that you're using to anchor a partial is going to be more susceptible to some sort of failure than a tooth that doesn't need to support anything, right? Because you're putting more stress onto it. The other thing, too, is a survey crown, you typically need to reduce a little bit more because you got to make room for this clasp or this framework to sit on. You see how the full contour of that tooth, or this crown, doesn't look like a full tooth. It's got a little setback in it. That's because when you seat your metal framework, you want it to be flush or you don't want it to be over-contoured. So those are the disadvantages of using it as a survey crown is one, yeah, there's more tooth reduction, and then two, it's taking on more stress than if nothing was hooked onto it. But obviously the benefit is, well, you have teeth back there that you're trying to replace other teeth. Okay, so you got to strategically choose your, this is what we call abutment teeth, or the supporting teeth, so that you don't overload it. So in this case, we're using the canines, and canines we know are the longest rooted tooth in our mouth, so that generally is a good abutment tooth. Okay, so that whole discussion is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but something to understand. So the part I want you to kind of take notes on or understand is that a survey crown is going to have some sort of indent or rest seat that the partial framework is going to sit on top of. So it just adds to the point that you can design these PFM crowns in sort of any shape that you would like. Of course, a survey crown could also be a full metal crown as well. You don't need to have the porcelain. Okay? So that's what I wrote up here. Survey crown is made out of PFM or full metal. And this is just a picture of what the metal framework looks like. And you see you have these little components that are going to rest on top of the tooth. And it's best to have these metal-to-metal contact. So the RPD framework will rest on and engage the survey crowns. The metal framework is composed. So this actual metal is composed of a cobalt chromium alloy. So this is a base metal. And then remember we talked about the ethyl silicate investment material? Well, the way that they cast this framework is ethyl silicate. If you think about what investment material they'll use to cast this crown, what do you think we would use? A phosphate bonded, okay, because this is still a crown. So specifically, ethyl silicate is for these full arch RPD metal frameworks, okay? So when we talk about ethyl silicate with RPDs, it's not talking about the survey crown specifically, it's talking about this metal piece that the crown sits on. All right, let's finish up here so we can get you back to sim. So at some point you're going to have your crown prepped, and then you're going to make an impression, and we're going to send the crowns to a laboratory so that they can fabricate it. So the thing that we want to teach you obviously is how to communicate to the lab, and the question is, well, what information does a lab need to fabricate a full metal crown for you? Right? You don't want the lab to be calling you and going, hey doc, you forgot to blah 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 blah. So for a full metal crown, this part's pretty easy. You know, you tell them the tooth number, and then out of the metals, we have 3 differing categories of metal. So you need to tell them if you want a high noble, a noble, or a base. So for a full metal crown, that's the important criteria, or the important part that you need to let them know outside of the tooth number, right? So the example, so this full cast crown. And this is our online form that we'll teach you how to fill out once you're ready for the clinic. So again, we have 2 different types that we'll use specifically at our school, our JUNCTION 56 and our JUNCTION Y+. So one is noble, the other is high noble. You want to pick one of the 2. So the question for the PFM crown, well, there's a lot more that goes into a porcelain infused metal crown, right? So not only do you need to tell them what type of metal, so high noble, noble base, but also, well, what type of material do you want on the occluding surface? So for our posterior teeth, it's going to be our occlusal surface, and our anterior teeth will be our lingual surface, or at least our maxillary anteriors. So remember, we saw the diagram where those can be either in metal or porcelain. So you got to specify what you want. The other thing too is the margin design. Well, you can again have a 360 metal where everything is, you know, buccal and lingual interproximal. You can have just a facial in porcelain, and then you can also have a porcelain butt margin or disappearing. So the default at ISO, we'll use a facial porcelain butt margin and a metal lingual color. That's why we have your prep 1.2 on the facial, 0.5 on the lingual. If you want something different, obviously you're going to prep differently, and then you're going to specify that in your lab prescription. And then finally, you're going to want to tell them what the shade of the porcelain, what color tooth you want. And a lot of times that's helpful to have pictures to send along, because we know that a tooth isn't just homogeneous in its color, it's got some characteristics in it. Okay, so those are the important things. Okay, so what type of metal? So you can imagine tooth number 30. Please fabricate a high noble PFM crown, porcelain occlusal, and I want a facial butt margin and a metal lingual color. And my shade is, and we'll learn about shades later, but like 2M2 is a porcelain shade that we would have. Okay, so here's one question is, as we talk about adding porcelain and kind of designing the crown once it's in the laboratory, well, what happens if there's insufficient occlusal reduction, and let's say your patient is already sent home? So we're going to come up with 3 different solutions to this. Okay, the first solution would be, well, unfortunately, your patient's got to come back, you'll reduce the prep, and then get a new impression. Okay, so, but this requires the patient obviously come back, which is not a great scenario, right? So you lose share time, the patient loses trust in you. So what are some things we can do to avoid the patient coming back, yet still make a crown to fit appropriately and have the sufficient thickness? Okay, so here we have outlined the tooth and the crown. So this is the ideal reduction. So let's say this crown was under-reduced, though. So if we were to make a crown, or sorry, Yeah, we're under-reduced. Well, one option is, once you have it mounted, so the blue outline means that this is in stone. So this is what the lab technician sees, okay? So they see, oh, insufficient space for a PFM. Crap. What do I do? So they'll call you and go, okay, you got insufficient space. One option is, hey, let me just grind on the opposing stone cast. And magically, we got space, right? So now they can go ahead and fabricate a crown. And then you're going to receive this crown, and then you're going to put it on the tooth. So, but when you put it on the tooth, you also have to reduce the opposing tooth to make it match the amount that the lab technician did. If you reduce the opposing tooth, then you can seat this crown appropriately, right? So at first, when the patient's seated and you remove the provisional, this is what you're going to see. And it's not until you reduce the opposing that you can make the crown fit. Make sense? So technician removes opposing. When the patient gets back, you remove the opposing. And then the crown will be of adequate thickness, and the occlusal contacts will be appropriate. But what's the downside of doing that? Well, you have to inform the patient, hey, I got to grind on your upper tooth. I have to remove a little bit of enamel. So sometimes you make sure, what you want to do is let the patient know that beforehand, so you're not just, so they at least think you know what you're doing, instead of like, oh, you screwed up and you have to keep grinding, okay? So that's reducing the opposing. Another option is what we call a reduction coping. So same scenario. And this is going to require a bit of your imagination to visualize this, but I'm going to try to teach you the concept of it, and then I'll try to get an actual example that we can show in sim. So same scenario, you're under-reduced, your lab technician looks at your cast and goes, oh, can't make a crown here of adequate thickness. So what are our options? So what we can do is make this reduction coping. So this outline we have in red is, think of it as a thin layer of acrylic that you've put over the tooth. So think of it like a coping, but instead of metal, it's acrylic. So it'll look something like this. For now, ignore the hole right there. So just a little plastic cap that fits onto your tooth, right? So with that little piece of acrylic sitting on there, now the lab technician is going to take a burr and they're going to prep away the area that's under-prepped to create your adequate reduction. So on the cast, on the stone die, they're going to grind through the acrylic plus a little bit of the stone. Then you're going to have something that looks like this. So part of the tooth is exposed, and that's what this diagram depicts. Okay? You can see a little window there where both the acrylic and stone have been removed. So then now they'll remove that piece of acrylic. Now they can make a crown to the proper thickness because your stone to stone distance is appropriate. Remember, this is all still in the lab. So they've ground down the stone die to the appropriate thickness. Okay? So you get a crown back of proper occlusal thickness. So now your patient comes, yeah, question? You'll see it, yeah. So now you have your patient back in the chair, and then you take off their provisional, and guess what? This is what you see in the patient's mouth. So obviously that space is still under-reduced, right? The patient's mouth hasn't changed. Well, now what you can do is okay, so I want to demonstrate that if you just seated this crown that the lab made and try to seat it onto the patient's tooth, well, it's obviously not going to seat because the inside of the crown looks different than what the patient currently presents with. Because remember, we had ground down part of the stone die, which that crown was made off of. So we need to grind down the patient's tooth the same way that we ground down the stone die. And that's where, and this is what you're talking about, this coping comes into play. Because now we can take that same coping and then seat it on the tooth. And guess what you're going to see when you see that coping seated? you're going to have a little bit of that tooth peeking outside of that acrylic, right? A little peekaboo, just saying hi. So what you have to do then is you take your burr and you line it up so that it removes all of the tooth structure that's sticking out of that window. So take your burr, hold it at the same angle, and then you're going to remove the tooth structure. Now guess what? Now your tooth will look like the stone cast. And remember, the crown is made on the stone cast. So if the tooth and the stone cast match up, then what do you think your crown is going to do? Now your crown can fully seat, okay? So yes, there's some inaccuracy because like how perfectly can you grind this tooth to mimic it exactly? Well, all you need to do is close, and you need to remove enough so that crown will seat. And this coping gives you sort of the outline in which and tells you how much of that tooth you need to reduce, okay? So that's the concept of a reduction coping. The reduction coping, again, is this plastic or acrylic little coping that fits on the tooth, and it's got a little window. So you'll seat it on the tooth, grind all the part of the tooth structure that's sticking out of the window. Once you've done that, then your crown should seat onto your tooth. Question? No, they make it before. So if you go back to this picture, I know these are really crappy pictures, but I did my best. So the red, you know, they have the dye, they'll add acrylic so it takes on the same form as the tooth. So pretend that picture on the left didn't have a hole in it. So it's all homogeneous. And then they go back. So once that coping is made, then they take a burr and then reduce it. So you're going to take away some of the acrylic and some of the stone in that cusp tip area. Okay? And then after you reduce it, that's what you see. Question? Or just stretching? Just stretching. Too much basketball, right? He's pitching. He's a lefty. You're a lefty? No. Oh. Okay. Question?
So with the reduction coping,
yes.
it leads to sharp edges, right? So not favorable.
Yeah, you can still go back and round those out if you want. Okay, so let's go back to this, right? So what's the problem with sharp edges? It's harder to capture the impression, and so it's hard to pour accurately without trapping bubbles, right? You don't need it because those two steps are already done, right? So if we're saying the disadvantage is it's hard to get an impression, it's hard to pour stone, well, your sharp edges are performed after those two things are already done, right? So sharp edges, and again, this is for PFM or metal crowns, you're generally not going to worry about areas of stress concentration because when's the last time you've seen a metal crown fracture in half? So that almost never happens, but with a ceramic restoration, all ceramic restoration, you're more worried about that, yeah. Okay, but let's say that sharp edge bothers you just because visually you don't like a sharp edge. What's the problem with rounding that out clinically? What if you took a little slow speed disc and just rounded it out? You'll just have a small gap there, right? So the principle is, as long as you reduce more on the tooth than what your lab technician did, your crown should still seat, right? So yes, if you round it out just because it makes you feel better, go ahead. If it's just a minimal amount, you're generally not going to alter your retention resistance form. Again, if you remove too much, what's going to happen? Your wall height's going to be shorter, you have poor adaptation to the crown, then your retention resistance form may be compromised. But when it's just a little rounding, you're probably okay. But again, the principle is if you clinically reduce more than the lab tech did on the cast, then it'll seat. If you remove less, let's say you try to fit that crown on and it still won't go down and the margins aren't sealed, but it's sealed perfectly on the die, that means that clinically you haven't reduced enough. Go back and check your reduction coping. And in a sense, you may want to overdo it in that area just to ensure that crown seats. Okay? Yes? Yeah, so a lot of that goes back to your treatment planning, right? And you want to see before you start, Typically what you're going to see is, oh, you have a previous restoration that was really close, and you have to remove that. So you want to identify those situations when you're close to the pulp, because sometimes that happens, but you want to let the patient know that, so that if you need to do a root canal, then they're prepared for it, okay? Because the solution to that is, if you're into the pulp, let's say, well, you have to hollow out the tooth, remove the nerve, do a root canal, and then put a crown, okay? But you look better and you look like an actual doctor if you can anticipate those things, whereas if you're telling the patient as they go, oh, whoops, you need a root canal now, they quickly lose trust, and they may not trust you as much because you're just putting out fires as they come. But you want to look at the tooth and go, hey, I'm getting close to the pulp. We're going to do your crown prep, but just to let you know, we're getting close to the nerve. You may have some damage to the nerve, which leads to root canal down the road. Okay? All right. Questions? Good? All right, so that's the concept of the reduction coping. Okay? So let me run through a few mounting exercises, because I feel like this is the area in which it requires, you don't need to be smart, you just got to be able to like visualize things, okay? So this is where we take, remember all those PAT questions that you would study for with like being able to visualize stuff? This is where it helps come into play. But these are some real clinical situations that you'll see, and you'll need to be able to troubleshoot these and think of the negative and the positive and see how it affects your final restoration. Okay, so we're going to paint a few scenarios to see if we can kind of think through this. So again, we have a crown. Let's see. So this is our wax up. The crown is waxed up. And the question is, what if there's a bubble in the investment material on the intaglio surface of the crown? So what's the intaglio? So let's jump to this slide here. Intaglio means the inside of the crown. The cameo means the outside, so the internal surface of the crown. So here's the example, right? We put the sprue. I know the sprue's in the wrong spot. I just did it because of the pictures, okay? So in crucible, sprue, and we're going to fill that with investment material. But there's a little air bubble that gets trapped on the intaglio surface of that wax up, or of that crown. What's the next step after you invest? What's that? Yeah, so part of the casting process would be to take that investment material and do what? Put it in the oven. What happens when you put it in the oven? The wax will disappear, okay? So this depicts the wax disappearing. Then what do you do after the wax disappears? Well, you heat up the metal until it's molten, and you sling it in there, and it's filled with gold. Okay? So you see how that little air bubble, how that affects the contour of the crown. So then you'll take it out, divest it, cut the sprue off. Now you go try to seat this crown on the tooth. What do you think is going to happen? It's going to be open margin and hyperocclusion because that little nodule is still there. So sometimes you'll have to go on the inside of the crown and remove that if you caught that there was a error there. Okay? So this will be an example of like a test question. We'll paint the scenario. There's an air bubble trapped on the intaglio surface of the crown before or during the investment procedure. What's going to happen to your crown when you try to seat it? So the answer in this scenario would be, well, it would be in hyperocclusion and open margin. So, right, assuming that you didn't correct for this error. Everybody with me? Okay. So how about another scenario? What happens if the die gets abraded before the wax up is completed? So let's pretend we had a sharp angle or a sharp point, and that sharp point got rounded off. So we'll be a little dramatic here, and what if you rounded it off like that, just because you abraded it? And then you made a wax up off of this die, right? So again, we'll run through the same steps. You'll invest, you'll burn out, you'll cast, take out the sprue, try to seat in the mouth. No good. Hyperocclusion, open margin. Okay. So this is the example that we had on the previous exam. What happens if you bevel the cusp after the provisional is made? So the blue crown there is our provisional. Okay. So we notice we're under-reduced, so we want to grind it more. So we take our burr and remove that little bit. And we have our same provisional, and we put it back on the tooth. Well, it's going to fit the same way. It's just going to be a little bit of a gap in between. Okay? So think about all the steps that you have in your fabrication process. Well, what if you get a bubble in your wax up? Well, what if you get a bubble in your impression material? What if you get a bubble in your investment? All these questions, yes? Uh-huh. Yeah, so I'll try to, I'll paint the scenario as clear as I can. But you have to think of the positive and the negative. If you understand all the steps in the fabrication, then we should be able to figure out what the error is. Sometimes there's a big error, like open margin hyperocclusion. Sometimes the errors don't really amount to anything, where this would still be okay for a provisional to seat that. Just got a little extra space in there. You may lose a little retention resistance form, but it just depends on how much you beveled it. Okay? Any questions about this type of stuff? So you're going to see more of these questions on Wednesday. So the best way to study for those is to, honestly, to make up your own scenarios and try them out with your classmates and see if you guys can figure out all the differing processes and the way to think about it. Okay?